somewhere above the Pacific Ocean, a capsule the size of a large SUV is falling toward Earth at 32 times the speed of sound. Inside it, 4 human beings are pressed into their seats by forces 6 times the weight of gravity. The windows are glowing white, the atmosphere is on fire around them, and in Houston, every screen in mission control has gone dark. No signal, no voice, no data, nothing. Just a clock, counting seconds, and the silence of 200 engineers who have spent years preparing for a moment they are completely powerless to influence. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is the most dangerous 4 minutes in human spaceflight since Apollo 13. And the shield standing between 4 astronauts and plasma hot enough to vaporize titanium is the same shield that behaved in ways nobody predicted the last time it flew. NASA knew. The crew knew. They flew anyway. What happens in those 4 minutes will determine whether humans return to the moon or whether everything stops. Right here, right now. If you have ever wanted to understand what real courage looks like wrapped inside real engineering, you're in exactly the right place. Subscribe, because this channel exists for moments exactly like this one. Let us begin. There is a moment somewhere between leaving and arriving where the nature of a journey changes completely. For the crew of Artemis II, that moment has a precise altitude. It has a precise speed. It has a name that engineers use in their planning documents, spoken with the kind of quiet seriousness that people reserve for things that truly matter. They call it entry interface. It happens at 122,000 meters above Earth's surface. And from that moment forward, nothing about the journey home is simple, gentle, or forgiving. Most of us, when we think about the dangers of space travel, picture the launch, the enormous rocket, the fire beneath it, the shaking and the roaring and the raw violence of escaping Earth's gravity. That image is not wrong. Launch is dangerous. But it is not the part that keeps engineers awake at night. It is not the phase of the mission where the margin between survival and catastrophe can be measured in centimeters of material. It is not the 4 minutes where no one, not the crew, not mission control, not the most powerful computers NASA has ever built, can change a single thing about what happens next. That window belongs entirely to re-entry. Here is what actually happens when a spacecraft comes home from the moon, and here is why it is so much more violent than most people realize. Orion will be traveling at just over 40,000 kilometers per hour when it reaches entry interface. That number deserves a moment. 40,000 kilometers per hour. A commercial aircraft cruises at roughly 900 kilometers per hour. A bullet fired from a rifle travels at about 3,600 kilometers per hour. Orion will be moving at more than 11 times the speed of a bullet. Mach 32, 32 times the speed of sound, faster than any human being has ever traveled in the entire history of our species. Now think about what air does at those speeds. At normal velocities, air moves out of the way. A car pushes through it. A plane cuts through it. Even a fast rocket, during its climb to orbit, moves quickly enough that the air parts around it with time to spare. But at Mach 32, air molecules cannot get out of the way. There is simply no time. The capsule arrives before the pressure wave that would normally signal its approach. The air in front of Orion has no warning, no chance to move. Instead, it compresses. Violently. Instantly. Enormously. And compressed air heats up. This is not a gentle warming. The temperature at the face of Orion's heat shield will climb above 2,760 degrees Celsius during peak re-entry heating. To put that number in terms the human body can feel, structural steel, the kind used in bridges and buildings, melts at around 1,370 degrees. Titanium, one of the strongest and most heat-resistant metals used in aerospace engineering, fails at around 1,670 degrees. The temperature that Orion's heat shield must face is nearly double the melting point of titanium. Without protection, the carbon fibre and titanium frame of the crew module would not just melt, it would vaporize in under a second. And this is where the story of re-entry becomes something stranger than most people expect. Because the air does not merely heat up. At those temperatures, the molecules in the compressed air do something that changes everything about the physics of the situation. They ionize. The electrons are stripped away from the atoms, and the gas transforms into something that is no longer quite a gas. It becomes plasma, a superheated, electrically charged state of matter that glows, that radiates heat in every direction, and that, critically, blocks radio waves across virtually every frequency that human technology uses to communicate. This is the origin of the blackout, not a technical failure, not a design flaw, pure physics. The plasma that forms around the capsule during peak heating is so dense with charged particles that no radio signal can penetrate it, inward or outward. Mission control cannot reach the crew. The crew cannot reach mission control. For roughly 4 minutes, during the most critical thermal event of the entire mission, complete silence. No spacecraft returning from the International Space Station faces anything like this. A capsule coming home from low Earth orbit re-enters at roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour. That is fast, and the thermal loads are real, but they are well understood across hundreds of missions. Engineers have tested them, modelled them, and refined them across decades of operational experience. The heating is intense but predictable. The blackout, if it occurs at all, is brief. Orion is not coming from low Earth orbit. Orion is coming from the Moon. The additional distance translates directly into additional velocity, and additional velocity translates directly into additional heat. The difference between 28,000 and 40,000 kilometers per hour is not just a larger number, it is a fundamentally different thermal environment, one that has only been survived before by the Apollo command modules, the last of which splashed down in December 1972. 54 years ago. That gap matters more than it might seem. In those 54 years, the engineers who designed and built the Apollo heat shields retired, aged, and in many cases passed away. The manufacturing techniques they used, the institutional knowledge they carried, the specific understanding of how ablative materials behave at lunar return velocities, all of that faded. Not disappeared entirely, but thinned, like a signal growing weaker with distance. When NASA began designing Orion and its heat shield, they were in certain important ways rebuilding from memory. This is the assumption that most people carry about Artemis II without realizing they carry it. The assumption that because Apollo worked, because the heat shields of the 1960s and 1970s brought every crew home safely, returning to that approach is simply a matter of using what was already proven. The assumption that the hard part is getting to the Moon, and that getting home is the solved problem, the known quantity, the technical achievement that humanity already put behind it more than half a century ago. That assumption is not slightly wrong, it is fundamentally wrong. Getting to the Moon is a problem of propulsion. It is a problem of thrust and fuel and orbital mechanics. Enormously complex, enormously expensive, but ultimately a matter of pushing hard enough in the right direction. Getting home from the Moon is something different in kind. It is a problem of survival, a problem of materials and physics and heat and timing, where the margin for error is not measured in kilometers or seconds, but in centimeters of engineered material and fractions of a degree of entry angle. Too shallow, and the capsule's trajectory carries it back out into space. Not slowed enough by the atmosphere, it skips off into an orbit it was never designed to maintain, with no way home. Too steep, and the heating rate exceeds what the shield can manage. The G-forces mount beyond what the crew can tolerate. The vehicle comes apart. The corridor that Orion must fly through is narrow, precisely defined. And it must be flown correctly, without adjustment, without the ability to communicate, inside a vehicle cocooned in fire. There is a question that the engineers at NASA cannot fully answer even now. They know the heat shield works. Artemis I proved it works well enough to protect an unmanned capsule through re-entry at lunar return velocity. But Artemis I also revealed something that no amount of ground testing had predicted. Something in the way the avcoat material behaved during that specific flight profile that no simulation had captured. Something that, when the engineers opened up the returned capsule and examined the shield closely, made the room go very quiet. That discovery is what changed everything about Artemis II. What it is, why it happened, and what NASA decided to do about it. That is the real story beneath the headline. And understanding it requires understanding first exactly what the heat shield is made of, how it works, and why a material designed to protect by destroying itself is one of the most remarkable things human engineering has ever produced. If you have found your way to this kind of content, to long, slow explorations of the science and the stakes behind the missions that define what our species is reaching toward, then you already know what this channel is about. Subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you will never miss one of these journeys. It genuinely makes a difference. Now, back to the fire. The answer to what went wrong begins not with Orion, but with Apollo. With a manufacturing process that took months of painstaking hand labour, and the decision, decades later, to find a faster way. There is a particular kind of engineering brilliance that looks, at first glance, like giving up. Not fighting, not resisting, not building something stronger and harder and more capable of withstanding the punishment being thrown at it, but instead designing something that absorbs the punishment by surrendering to it, layer by layer, deliberately, in a controlled, precisely engineered act of self-destruction that saves everything behind it by sacrificing everything in front. That is what Orion's heat shield does, and understanding it changes the way you think about what protection actually means. The material is called avcoat. The name is not glamorous. It does not sound like something standing between 4 human beings and plasma hot enough to vaporize titanium. But avcoat is one of the most carefully engineered substances ever created for a specific purpose, and that purpose is singular and uncompromising: to burn, slowly, predictably, in exactly the right way, at exactly the right rate, so that the structure behind it stays cool enough to survive while the material itself is consumed by the very fire it is fighting. Engineers have a word for this category of heat protection. They call it ablative, from the Latin word meaning to carry away. And that is precisely what the shield does. It carries the heat away from the spacecraft by absorbing it into its own structure, converting it into chemical reactions and mechanical erosion, and then releasing it into the airstream as the charred outer layer breaks free and falls behind the descending capsule. Here is how it works, in the sequence that actually occurs during re-entry. As Orion hits the upper atmosphere and the temperature at the shield face begins to climb, the outermost layer of avcoat starts to char. This is not random burning. It is a specific chemical transformation. The organic compounds in the avcoat material undergo pyrolysis, which means they break down under extreme heat without oxygen. They do not combust the way a piece of paper burns in open air. They transform. The solid material converts into a porous, rigid char layer on the outside, while gases are produced internally as byproducts of that chemical breakdown. Or those gases are important. They flow outward through the porous char layer, moving from the hotter outer surface toward the cooler interior. As they move, they carry thermal energy with them, bleeding heat away from the deeper layers of the shield, and when the char layer itself finally erodes away into the high-speed airstream, It takes enormous amounts of absorbed energy with it. Gone. Carried behind the capsule and dispersed into the atmosphere. What remains beneath the consumed layer is fresh avcoat, ready to begin the process again. Layer by layer, the shield retreats. Layer by layer, it gives ground to the heat. And layer by layer, the crew module behind it stays cool enough that the 4 people inside can survive. This is the genius of ablative protection. It does not require the material to be stronger than the heat it faces. It requires the material to fail in exactly the right way. A controlled failure, engineered with extraordinary precision, that turns destruction into defense. Now here is the number that makes this feel real. During the 4 minutes of peak heating, the temperature on the face of Orion's heat shield will exceed 2,760 degrees Celsius. Inside the crew cabin, on the other side of that shield, the temperature must remain survivable. During the Artemis I unmanned test flight, the cabin temperature never exceeded the mid-70s Fahrenheit. That is roughly 24 degrees Celsius, a comfortable room temperature. The difference between the outer face of the shield and the interior of the capsule is more than 2,700 degrees, across a material that is only a few centimeters thick. A few centimeters, the width of 2 or 3 of your fingers pressed together. That is the physical distance across which one of the most extreme thermal gradients ever engineered by human beings is maintained. On one side, plasma. On the other, 4 people in pressure suits, breathing, waiting, trusting. But avcoat does not work by simply being thick enough to outlast the heat. The thickness matters, but the behavior of the material under specific heating conditions matters more. And this is where the story stops being straightforward, because avcoat's behavior turns out to be sensitive in ways that were not fully understood until a capsule actually flew the specific profile that Orion must fly. There is an open question in ablative heat shield science that does not get discussed enough outside of engineering circles. The question is not whether ablative materials work. They clearly do. The question is whether they work predictably, whether the rate of material loss, the depth of char formation, the internal gas dynamics, all of it, behave the way ground testing and computer modelling predict they will behave under the specific, unrepeatable conditions of an actual flight. Ground testing can reproduce high temperatures. Arc jet facilities, which are essentially enormous plasma torches, can heat material samples to re-entry temperatures and measure how they respond. NASA conducted extensive arc jet testing of avcoat samples before both Artemis I and Artemis II. The results were used to build the computer models that predicted how the full heat shield would perform during re-entry. But there is something that arc jet testing cannot fully replicate. It cannot reproduce the exact geometry of a 5-meter heat shield moving through the atmosphere at Mach 32 with a specific angle of attack, a specific rotation, a specific heating profile that changes second by second as the capsule decelerates. The heating is not uniform across the shield face. The center experiences different conditions than the edges. The char forms at different rates in different locations, and the gases produced by pyrolysis must vent through a char layer that is simultaneously forming, densifying and eroding all at once across a surface the size of a small living room floor. These are conditions that can only be tested in one way, by flying. And here is what makes avcoat's story genuinely strange. The material was chosen for Orion precisely because it had already proven itself on Apollo. Every Apollo command module that returned astronauts from the Moon, from Apollo 8 in 1968 through Apollo 17 in 1972, used avcoat as its primary thermal protection. 6 successful lunar return re-entries. Not a single heat shield failure. Not a single crew member lost to thermal protection breakdown. That record inspired confidence. Deep, institutional confidence. The kind that feels like certainty when you look at it from the outside. 6 for 6. proven, known, safe. What that confidence did not fully account for was this. The Apollo heat shields flew a specific re-entry profile. Orion, with its more advanced guidance systems and its requirement to land in a precise target zone, was designed to fly a different one. A profile that had never been flown before at lunar return velocities. A maneuver called skip re-entry, which looked on paper like a significant improvement over what Apollo had done. It was not. Not for the avcoat, but understanding why requires understanding first how the shield was rebuilt for Orion. Because the manufacturing process changed significantly between the 1960s and now. And that change introduced a variable that nobody had fully tested, sitting quietly inside those 186 bonded blocks, waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. The gap between what the models predicted and what actually happened during flight is one of the most important lessons in modern aerospace engineering. Not because it means the models are useless, they are not, but because it means that the final test of any heat shield is the same now as it was in 1968. You build the best thing you know how to build, you test it as thoroughly as you can, and then you fly it. And you learn what the atmosphere actually thinks of your work. The atmosphere does not negotiate. It does not accept partial credit. It gives you a result clearly and completely, as in the time it takes to fall from 122,000 meters to the surface of the ocean. What Artemis I's result revealed, when the engineers finally got the capsule back and looked closely at what the atmosphere had done to the shield, was something that changed the entire trajectory of the Artemis program. And the first piece of that picture begins with understanding how NASA rebuilt avcoat from scratch, not the material itself, the way it was assembled, the decision to simplify a process that the original engineers had done by hand, one tiny cell at a time, over months of careful, painstaking labor. A decision that saved time. Whether it preserved everything that made the original work so reliably is a question whose answer arrived at 32 times the speed of sound. There is something deeply human about going back to what worked before. When a problem is serious enough, when the stakes are high enough, when the cost of being wrong is measured in human lives rather than budgets or timelines, the instinct to reach for the proven thing is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the accumulated weight of experience saying, "We know this works. We have seen it work. We do not need to invent something new when something old already solved the problem." That instinct is what brought NASA back to avcoat when it came time to protect Orion. And to understand why that decision felt so completely reasonable, you need to understand what the original Apollo heat shields actually were. Not in the abstract, in the physical, tangible, almost incomprehensible detail of how they were made. The Apollo Command Module heat shield was not a single piece of material. It was not a coating applied to the outside of the capsule like paint. It was a structure, a honeycomb structure, built from a fiberglass and phenolic resin matrix, containing roughly 320,000 individual hexagonal cells. Each cell was small, about the diameter of a pencil eraser, and each one of those 320,000 cells was filled by hand with avcoat material, using something resembling a modified caulking gun, by technicians who worked with the focused patience of people who understood exactly what their work was for. Think about that number for a moment. 320,000 individual cells. If you filled one cell every 10 seconds without stopping, without rest, the job would take more than 36 days of continuous work. In reality, it took months. Teams of skilled technicians working carefully, methodically, ensuring that each tiny cell was properly filled, that no voids were left, that the material was distributed correctly across the entire surface of the shield. It was slow. It was expensive. It was labor-intensive in a way that modern manufacturing processes are specifically designed to eliminate. but it produced something with a particular quality that matters enormously in ablative heat shield performance: continuity. The avcoat in the Apollo shields was essentially a single continuous mass of material. There were no seams between large sections, no boundaries where one block ended and another began, no interfaces where the bond between pieces might behave differently than the material on either side of it. The honeycomb cells provided structural support, but the avcoat itself was one integrated whole, responding to heating as a unified system. This continuity meant that when the char formed during re-entry, it formed across a surface with consistent mechanical properties. When the internal gases produced by pyrolysis needed to vent through the char layer, they moved through a material that behaved the same way from one end of the shield to the other. The ablation was even, predictable, controlled. 6 Apollo missions carried astronauts home from the moon through re-entry. 6 heat shields, 6 splashdowns. Oh, not one failure. Not one crew member lost to thermal protection breakdown during the most dangerous phase of the most ambitious voyages human beings had ever undertaken. When you have a record like that, confidence is the natural response. Not arrogance, not carelessness, but genuine evidence-based confidence in a material and a method that had been tested in the most demanding environment imaginable, repeatedly, and had never once let anyone down. That confidence became part of NASA's institutional memory. It survived the long pause after Apollo. It survived the shuttle era, during which re-entry was handled by ceramic tiles rather than ablative material, and which ended with 2 catastrophic losses that had nothing to do with the tile system's fundamental approach. It survived the decades during which no American spacecraft needed to handle lunar return velocities, because no American spacecraft was going to the moon. When the Constellation program, Orion's original predecessor, was being designed in the mid-2000s, the engineers tasked with the heat shield had a choice. They could develop an entirely new thermal protection material, something engineered from scratch for modern manufacturing processes, with modern computational tools to optimize its performance. Or they could return to avcoat, the material that had brought every Apollo crew home. They chose avcoat, and the reasoning was sound. Why introduce a new variable when the existing solution has a perfect track record? Why spend years qualifying a new material when one that works already exists? The lunar return heating environment is not a mystery. Apollo defined it. Avcoat survived it. Use avcoat. But here is where the assumption quietly entered the room, unannounced, and sat down at the engineering table without being properly examined. The Apollo shields worked flawlessly. That is true and unambiguous. But they worked flawlessly in a specific configuration, manufactured in a specific way, flying a specific re-entry profile. The confidence in avcoat as a material was completely justified. The confidence that any implementation of avcoat would perform the same way under any re-entry profile was a different claim entirely, and it was a claim that was never fully tested before it became the foundation of a program designed to carry human beings. The manufacturing process was the first place where the implementation diverged from the original, because when Lockheed Martin, the prime contractor for the Orion crew module, sat down to figure out how to apply avcoat to a heat shield 5 meters in diameter, filling 320,000 individual cells by hand was simply not on the table. Not in the budget, not in the timeline, not in any modern production framework that had to deliver hardware within a program schedule measured in years rather than decades. So they redesigned the application method. Instead of a continuous honeycomb-filled cell by cell, they would manufacture approximately 186 blocks of pre-machined avcoat. Each block would be shaped to fit a specific location on the carbon fiber skin of the heat shield. Each block would be bonded into place using an adhesive system, fitted together like the pieces of a very large, very expensive, very consequential puzzle. The result looked right. The blocks were made of the same avcoat material. They were tested in arc jet facilities. They were analysed with computational fluid dynamics models. They met every specification that the engineers could write down, and they saved an enormous amount of time compared to filling 320,000 cells by hand. What the blocks introduced quietly and without announcement was something the specifications had not fully captured, or interfaces, boundaries between pieces where the material properties were not perfectly continuous. Seams where the bond layer between blocks represented a slightly different thermal and mechanical environment than the avcoat on either side. Whether those interfaces would matter during actual flight was a question that nobody could answer from ground testing alone. The arc jets could heat individual blocks. They could test the bond material in isolation. They could model the behavior of the full shield using the properties measured from samples. But they could not reproduce in a ground facility the full three-dimensional reality of 186 bonded blocks responding together to the specific dynamic changing heating environment of a lunar return re-entry. The only way to answer the question was to fly, and here is the detail that carries the most weight when you sit with it quietly. The engineers knew this. They understood that some questions about heat shield performance can only be answered by actual flight. They knew that Artemis I, the unmanned test flight, was in part designed to answer exactly those questions. The test was real and serious and carefully planned. But when the results came back, when the engineers at Kennedy Space Center removed the heat shield from the returned Artemis I capsule and began examining it under lights and magnification, what they found was not the confirmation of their models that they had hoped for. It was something more complicated, more troubling, and considerably more difficult to explain. The material had worked, the crew cabin had stayed cool, the shield had done its fundamental job, but the way it had done that job, the physical evidence of what had happened to those 186 blocks during re-entry, told a story that the models had not written. A story about gases and pressure, and the specific vulnerability that the block manufacturing method had introduced into a material that everyone had trusted for more than 50 years. Understanding that story requires understanding one more thing first. The maneuver that Artemis I flew on the way home, the one that Apollo never flew, the one that looked, on paper, like a modern improvement, the one that turned out to be, inside the avcoat, something close to a catastrophe. There is a particular kind of problem that only reveals itself under pressure. Not the pressure of testing, not the pressure of simulation, not the pressure of engineers sitting in rooms running calculations on the most powerful computers available to them, but the real, physical, unrepeatable pressure of an actual event. The kind of problem that hides perfectly inside every model, passes every inspection, satisfies every specification, and then quietly announces itself at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way. The decision to redesign the avcoat application method for Orion was not reckless. It was not the result of cutting corners to save money or rushing a schedule for political reasons. It was a considered engineering choice, made by experienced people, that is backed by analysis and testing, and the reasonable judgment that a material with a perfect track record could be successfully adapted to a modern manufacturing process without losing the properties that made it work. The choice was to move from 320,000 hand-filled honeycomb cells to approximately 186 pre-machined avcoat blocks, bonded to the carbon fiber skin of the heat shield like tiles on a very large, very specialized mosaic. Each block was precisely shaped to fit its designated location. Each was tested individually. Each met the material specifications that the program had established based on decades of avcoat research and the Apollo performance record. On paper, the blocks were avcoat. In the laboratory, they behaved like avcoat. In the arc jet facilities where NASA tested thermal protection materials by blasting them with plasma streams that simulated re-entry heating, they performed within the expected range. but a block is not a continuous surface, and the difference between a continuous surface and 186 bonded pieces turns out to matter in a way that is subtle enough to escape detection in ground testing and consequential enough to show up unmistakably on a returned spacecraft. Here is the specific physical difference that the block design introduced. In the original Apollo honeycomb design, the avcoat material was essentially one connected mass. When it heated during re-entry, it responded as a whole. The char that formed on the surface was continuous. The gases produced internally by pyrolysis had a consistent, predictable path through the porous char layer to the outside. The mechanical stresses created by extreme heating were distributed across the entire integrated structure rather than concentrated at specific points. In the block design, each of the 186 pieces is a discrete unit. It has edges. It has interfaces where it meets the adjacent block and where it meets the carbon fiber skin beneath it. Those interfaces are filled with bonding material which is not avcoat. It has slightly different thermal properties, slightly different mechanical behavior, slightly different porosity. And when the entire surface is subjected to temperatures above 2,700 degrees Celsius, those differences, and small as they are under normal conditions, become meaningful. The char layer does not form with perfect uniformity across 186 separate blocks. The edges of each block are slightly different from the centers. The bond lines between blocks represent discontinuities in an otherwise continuous thermal protection system. These are not dramatic differences. They're not visible to the naked eye under normal conditions. But at Mach 32, in a plasma environment that is measuring and exploiting every weakness in the material it is attacking, small differences become large consequences. This is the hidden question that the block design introduced. Not whether avcoat worked. It worked. Not whether the blocks would protect the crew module from the heat. The Artemis I data confirmed they would. The hidden question was whether the ablation would be predictable, whether the material loss would follow the controlled, even manageable pattern that the models forecast, or whether the blocks would behave differently from one another, shedding material at different rates, in different patterns, in ways that could not be anticipated in advance. Unpredictable ablation in a heat shield is not automatically catastrophic. The shield can lose more material than expected in certain locations and still protect the crew module behind it, as long as it does not lose so much that the underlying structure is exposed to temperatures it cannot handle. But unpredictable ablation means that the safety margin, the carefully calculated buffer between how much material is expected to be lost and how much can be lost before the situation becomes dangerous, is no longer a reliable number. It becomes a guess, an educated guess, supported by testing and modelling, but a guess nonetheless. And here is what makes this particular guess so consequential. The safety margin in a heat shield is not generous. Orion's avcoat blocks range from approximately 2.5 to 7.5 centimeters thick. That is the total available material. The models predict how much of that thickness will be consumed during re-entry. The remainder is the margin. If the actual consumption is significantly higher than predicted, in ways that cannot be forecast because the block interfaces behave differently from the continuous material the models assumed, then the margin shrinks, perhaps to nothing, perhaps below nothing. The question could not be answered from the ground. It could not be answered by testing individual blocks in ArcJet facilities, because the ArcJets cannot reproduce the full-scale, dynamic, three-dimensional heating environment of an actual lunar return re-entry. They can approximate it. They cannot replicate it. The only way to answer the question was to fly an actual Orion capsule through an actual lunar return re-entry and examine what came back. That was, explicitly and by design, one of the purposes of Artemis I. The unmanned test flight that launched in November 2022 sent an uncrewed Orion on a 25-day journey around the Moon and back, and returned a capsule whose heat shield could be removed and examined in detail at Kennedy Space Center. The flight itself was, by almost every measure, a success. The Space Launch System rocket performed well. The Orion capsule completed its trajectory around the Moon. The re-entry went as planned. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, was recovered, and was transported back to Kennedy Space Center for post-flight analysis. And then the engineers took the heat shield off. What they found when they examined it under proper lighting and magnification was not what the models had predicted, not a disaster, but not confirmation either. Something in between, and in some ways more troubling than either extreme, because it was unexpected in a way that the models had given no warning of. The damage was real. More than 100 locations across the shield showed material loss that had not been predicted. Large sections of charred avcoat had broken away in irregular chunks. Not the smooth, even layer-by-layer erosion that the ablation models described. Jagged, uneven, unpredictable losses that had exposed layers of the shield material that were never supposed to encounter re-entry temperatures directly. But here is the detail that makes the story genuinely complicated rather than simply alarming. The cabin was fine. The temperature inside the Orion crew module during re-entry never exceeded the mid-70s Fahrenheit. The thermal performance of the shield, its fundamental job of keeping the heat away from the crew, had exceeded expectations. The avcoat was blocking the heat effectively, even as it tore itself apart in ways nobody had forecast. This is the paradox that the Artemis I heat shield investigation had to untangle. A shield that worked thermally but failed structurally in ways the models had not predicted. A material that protected the capsule while behaving differently from anything the testing had suggested it would do. The investigation that followed was detailed, careful, and ultimately revealing. It pointed not to the avcoat material itself as the source of the problem, and not to the block manufacturing method in isolation, but to the interaction between the block design and a specific feature of the re-entry flight profile that Artemis I had flown, a maneuver that Apollo never used, a maneuver that had been added to Orion's capabilities as a modern improvement, offering greater landing precision and more flexibility in choosing a splashdown location. A maneuver that looked, from a mission planning perspective, like a straightforward upgrade. Inside the avcoat it was something else entirely. The maneuver was called skip re-entry, and understanding what it did to the gas dynamics inside those 186 bonded blocks, during the brief pause in heating when the capsule climbed back above the atmosphere, is understanding the specific mechanism that cracked the shield from within. Not from the outside, where the plasma was, from the inside where the pressure had nowhere to go. That mechanism, and the decision it forced NASA to make about how to bring 4 people home from the Moon, is where the story of Artemis II truly begins. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over an engineering team when the data does not match the prediction. Not the silence of confusion, not the silence of people who do not understand what they are looking at, but the silence of people who understand exactly what they are looking at and who are working through, in real time, what it means for everything that comes after. It is the silence of a room where someone has just realized that a confident assumption, built over years of careful work, has just been quietly contradicted by physical evidence. That silence fell at Kennedy Space Center sometime in late 2022, after the Artemis I capsule came back from the Moon, and the engineers removed the heat shield and looked at what the atmosphere had done to it. Artemis I launched on November 16, 2022. It was by almost any measure you choose to apply a triumph. The Space Launch System, NASA's most powerful rocket since Saturn V, performed its first ever flight with remarkable precision. The Orion capsule separated cleanly, executed its translunar injection burn, travelled outward to the Moon, completed a distant retrograde orbit that took it roughly 70,000 kilometers beyond the lunar far side, and then began the long fall back toward Earth. The re-entry, watched by teams in Houston and captured by tracking assets in the Pacific, went as planned. The capsule hit the atmosphere at lunar return velocity. The plasma formed. The blackout occurred. And then, right on schedule, the signal came back. The parachutes deployed. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on December 11, 2022, 25 days after launch. Recovery teams retrieved it. Engineers transported it back to Kennedy Space Center, and then they did what engineers do after a test flight. They took it apart and looked at everything. The heat shield came off first, because the heat shield was one of the primary things Artemis I was designed to test. And what the engineers saw when they examined it closely was not what decades of ground testing and sophisticated computer modeling had told them to expect. More than 100 locations across the 5-meter shield surface showed damage that the models had not predicted. Not minor surface variations. Not the kind of small discrepancies that appear in any complex engineering test and fall within acceptable bounds. Significant, visible, undeniable material loss in locations and patterns that the ablation models had given no warning of. Large sections of charred avcoat had broken away from the shield in chunks, irregular chunks. Not the smooth, controlled, layer-by-layer erosion that ablative theory describes, and that ground testing had consistently shown. The material had come off in pieces, in patterns that varied unpredictably from one location to another, and in some areas the loss had been deep enough to expose layers of the shield that were specifically designed never to experience direct re-entry heating. The structural integrity of the underlying carbon fiber skin had not been compromised. The temperature inside the cabin had remained completely safe. In that fundamental sense, the shield had worked. But the way it had worked, the physical evidence of how it had behaved during those minutes of peak heating, was different from anything the program had predicted. And different, in the context of a heat shield protecting human lives, is not a comfortable word. The investigation that followed was thorough. Engineers examined every section of the damaged shield, correlating the location and pattern of each area of unexpected material loss with the specific heating conditions that location would have experienced during re-entry. They ran new models, they tested new samples. They looked for the mechanism that could explain what they were seeing, and they found it. Not in the avcoat material itself, and not in the block manufacturing method alone, but in the interaction between those blocks and the specific re-entry maneuver that Artemis I had flown, a maneuver called skip re-entry, chosen for its practical advantages and its modern precision, which turned out to create conditions inside the avcoat blocks that no ground test had ever reproduced. Skip re-entry works like this. Instead of diving directly into the atmosphere and riding the deceleration all the way to splashdown, the capsule enters the upper atmosphere at a shallow angle, uses aerodynamic drag to shed a portion of its velocity, and then uses the lift generated by its shape to climb back above the sensible atmosphere. It coasts briefly in near vacuum, having shed some speed, and then re-enters for a second, final pass that carries it to splashdown. The advantage is significant. By extending the re-entry corridor across 2 passes rather than 1, mission planners can control where the capsule lands with much greater precision. They can target a specific splashdown zone thousands of kilometers from where a direct re-entry would deliver them. For a crewed mission, this flexibility matters. It means recovery ships can be pre-positioned with confidence, and the crew can be reached quickly after splashdown. Apollo never flew skip re-entry. The Apollo command modules came straight in, direct descents that delivered the capsule to a relatively broad target zone in the Pacific. The precision was adequate for recovery operations, but it was not the kind of pinpoint accuracy that modern mission planners prefer. Skip re-entry looked like the obvious improvement. On paper it was. But inside the avcoat, during the brief period when the capsule climbed back above the atmosphere between its two passes, something happened that nobody had predicted. Here is the mechanism, explained as simply as the physics allows. During the first pass through the atmosphere, the outer layer of the avcoat chars under the intense heating. That char layer is porous, allowing the gases produced internally by pyrolysis to vent outward through it. The system is self-regulating under sustained heating. The gas production and the venting stay in rough balance, and the ablation proceeds in the controlled, predictable way the models describe. Then the capsule climbs back above the atmosphere. The external heating drops sharply and quickly. The char layer, which had been porous and permeable under sustained high heat, cools slightly and densifies. It becomes less porous, less permeable to the gases trying to move through it from beneath. But the avcoat underneath the char layer is still warm enough to keep producing pyrolysis gases, even though the external heating has dropped. Those gases are still being generated internally. They are moving toward the char layer as they always do, looking for the path they have always had to the outside, and the path is closing. The char layer is becoming denser, less open. The gases accumulate in the space between the still warm avcoat beneath and the increasingly impermeable char above. Pressure builds. Slowly at first, then more rapidly, as the gas production continues and the venting pathway narrows. Then the capsule re-enters for its second pass. The external heating surges again. The thermal shock hits the pressurized pockets inside the blocks, and the blocks crack. Not from the outside in, where the plasma is doing its visible work, from the inside out, where the trapped gas pressure has been building quietly, invisibly, through the entire skip phase. The charred material that should have eroded away in a controlled manner instead breaks off in irregular chunks, driven from within by pressure rather than consumed from without by heat. This is the mechanism the investigation identified. Internal gas pressure, driven by this specific thermal cycling of skip re-entry, fracturing the char layer and causing unpredictable, chunky material loss that the ablation models had never been designed to capture, because the models had never been asked to simulate this particular sequence of heating, cooling, and reheating. And here is the detail that does not get discussed enough. Even with all of that unexpected material loss, even with more than 100 locations of unpredicted damage, the cabin stayed safe. None of the thermal performance held. The avcoat, tearing itself apart in ways no model predicted, still kept the heat away from the crew module. That fact is both reassuring and deeply unsettling at the same time. Reassuring because it means the shield has more capacity than the model suggested. Unsettling because it means the models do not accurately describe what the shield actually does. And a model you cannot trust is not a model you can use to calculate a safety margin, which left NASA with a specific, urgent, and very uncomfortable problem. Artemis II was already being built. The heat shield was already bonded to the crew module. 4 people were already training to fly it. Forscats, and the test data from the only flight that had ever put an Orion heat shield through a real lunar return re-entry had just revealed that the shield behaves in ways that nobody fully understands. What NASA did next, and what it reveals about the nature of acceptable risk in human spaceflight, is the part of this story that sits most heavily. Because the answer was not to start over. It could not be. And understanding why requires sitting with the full weight of what that decision meant for 4 people who had not yet climbed into the capsule. There is a difference between a problem you do not know about and a problem you know about completely. The first kind is the most dangerous kind in spaceflight. It is the foam strike on Columbia's wing that nobody caught in time. It is the O-ring erosion on Challenger that was documented, discussed, and ultimately dismissed on a cold January morning in 1986. The known unknown that became the unknown unknown, because the people who needed to act on it convinced themselves, for reasons that felt reasonable at the time, that it was not as serious as the data suggested. The second kind is different. When you know about a problem completely, when you have examined it from every angle, tested every scenario, modelled every outcome, and arrived at a clear understanding of exactly what you're dealing with, the decision you make about it is a different kind of decision. Not easier, not more comfortable, but more honest, more deliberate, more fully owned by the people making it. NASA knew about the Artemis I heat shield problem completely, or as completely as the available data allowed. The investigation was thorough. The mechanism was understood. The photographs of the damage were examined in detail by every engineer with relevant expertise. The models were revised, new tests were run, and when the full picture came into focus, the people responsible for Artemis II had to make a decision that no amount of additional analysis could make simple. The heat shield bonded to the Orion crew module that 4 astronauts would fly was the same design that had produced more than 100 locations of unexpected damage on Artemis I. Not a different version, not an improved iteration. The same design, already installed, already integrated into the vehicle, already part of a spacecraft that had taken years to build, and that was the only Orion crew module in existence. Replacing it was not impossible in a purely technical sense. The heat shield can be removed and reattached. The process exists. But replacing it with a meaningfully different design, one that addressed the block interface problem identified in the Artemis I investigation, would have required developing and qualifying a new manufacturing approach, testing it extensively and producing a new shield. The timeline for that work was measured not in months but in years. Artemis II had already slipped. The original target was 2024, then 2025, then 2026. Each delay had consequences that extended beyond the mission itself, affecting the industrial workforce, the international partnerships, the budget allocations, and the broader momentum of a program designed to return humans to the moon. Another multi-year delay would not simply push a date on a calendar. It would threaten the viability of the program itself. Jared Isaacman, the NASA administrator who reviewed the heat shield investigation data and made the final call on how to proceed, is not a career bureaucrat. He is a pilot. He flew to orbit aboard a SpaceX Dragon on the Polaris Dawn mission in 2024, conducted a spacewalk from a commercial spacecraft, and understands the lived reality of spaceflight risk from the inside of a pressure suit. When he looked at the Artemis I damage data, he was not looking at it from behind a desk. He was looking at it as someone who had made his own calculation about acceptable risk and climbed aboard a rocket. His decision was to fly the existing shield. Not unchanged, but not rebuilt. Instead, the fix would be in the flight plan rather than the hardware. The skip re-entry maneuver that had caused the internal gas pressure problem was eliminated entirely. Orion would not bounce off the atmosphere on the way home. It would come in direct. Steeper, faster. A single continuous pass from entry interface to splashdown, with no pause in heating that could allow the char layer to densify and trap pyrolysis gases beneath it. This was not a small change. The flight profile is not a minor operational detail. It is the fundamental description of how the vehicle interacts with the atmosphere during the most critical phase of the mission. Changing from skip re-entry to direct re-entry changes the heating rate, the deceleration profile, the peak G-forces experienced by the crew, the structural loads on the vehicle, and the flexibility available to mission planners in choosing a splashdown location. The direct re-entry profile hits harder. There is no other way to describe it. The capsule enters the atmosphere at a steeper angle, which means the deceleration is more compressed in time. The same velocity that had to be shed across a 2-pair skip profile now has to be shed in a single continuous pass. The peak heating is more intense, the G-forces are higher, the window for mission control to influence the trajectory is narrower. But the direct profile does one thing that the skip profile cannot do. It keeps the heating continuous. There is no pause, no moment where the char layer cools and densifies and traps the gases that are still being produced beneath it. The pyrolysis gases that form inside the avcoat blocks during heating have a consistent, continuously open path through the porous char to the outside. The pressure does not build. The blocks do not crack from within. The ablation proceeds in the controlled, manageable way the material was designed to produce, in theory. Based on testing and modelling conducted after the Artemis, one investigation identified the mechanism. NASA tested avcoat samples under the direct re-entry heating profile in arc jet facilities at Ames Research Center. They modelled the gas dynamics inside the blocks under the new thermal cycling conditions. They ran scenarios where the heat shield lost significantly more material than Artemis I had experienced, and examined whether the underlying structure and the crew module behind it would remain intact. In every simulation, every model, every arc jet test conducted under the modified profile, the results were acceptable, the cabin integrity held, the material loss, while sometimes higher than nominal predictions, stayed within bounds that the structure could survive. But here is the open question that sits at the centre of all of that testing, and that cannot be resolved by any ground facility or any computer model, no matter how sophisticated. The ArcJet tests are not the flight. The models are not the atmosphere. The simulations are constructed from the same fundamental understanding of avcoat behaviour that produced the pre-Artemis I models, the models that did not predict what actually happened during that flight. The revised models are better. They incorporate the new data. They account for the gas pressure mechanism that the investigation identified. They are the best tools available, but they are still models, and models of a system that has already surprised their creators once carry a specific, irreducible uncertainty that cannot be tested away. It can only be acknowledged, quantified as honestly as possible, and accepted or rejected. NASA quantified it. The agency's own estimates placed the overall mission risk for Artemis II, across all failure modes, somewhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 50. That is an extraordinary range. At the optimistic end, a 2% chance of crew loss. At the pessimistic end, it is a coin flip. NASA's official threshold for acceptable risk on Artemis crewed missions is 1 in 30. Whether the actual risk falls within that threshold depends on which models you trust, which assumptions you accept, and ultimately on how much weight you give to the argument that a system, which already surprised you, once might surprise you again in ways the revised models have not captured. Isaacman accepted the risk. The program accepted the risk. The flight plan was modified. The shield stayed. And 4 people were told that the vehicle they were going to fly had a heat shield that had not behaved as predicted during its only previous flight at lunar return velocity. That the fix was a change in how the vehicle would fly, rather than what it was made of. And that the best estimate of the probability that this approach would keep them alive ranged across an interval wide enough to contain both reassurance and genuine fear. What those 4 people did with that information is the part of this story that is hardest to quantify and easiest to misunderstand. Because they did not simply accept the risk the way a passenger accepts the statistical risk of a commercial flight, trusting that someone else has done the calculation correctly. They understood the calculation. They had the data. They reviewed the photographs. They knew what 1 in 50 means. And understanding what that knowledge meant to them requires understanding who they are, not their titles or their mission patches, who they actually are, what they have already done, and what that tells you about the specific nature of the decision they made when they looked at the risk numbers and then looked at the capsule and climbed inside. That is a different kind of question than the engineering questions that have occupied this story so far. But it is not a less important one, because the heat shield, the flight profile, the risk estimates, the modified re-entry plan, all of it exists in service of a single purpose: getting 4 specific human beings home from the farthest point any human being has ever travelled. And those 4 human beings had already decided before the launch date was confirmed, before the modified flight plan was finalised, before the arc jet tests at Ames were complete, that they were going. There is a moment in every serious engineering program where the question shifts. It stops being purely a technical question. It stops being about materials and models and test data and flight profiles. It becomes something harder to measure and harder to defend in a formal review. It becomes a question about how much uncertainty is acceptable when the thing at risk is not a vehicle or a schedule or a budget, but a human life. 4 human lives. Specific people with names and families and the full weight of individual existence behind them. NASA has a formal framework for answering that question. It is called the loss of crew probability estimate, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A number, a single probability value, derived from fault trees and failure mode analyses and historical data and engineering judgment, that represents the agency's best estimate of the likelihood that a given mission will end with crew members dying. It is one of the most sobering numbers in all of engineering, because it takes something that feels morally absolute, the value of a human life, and converts it into a fraction. For Artemis missions, NASA's official acceptable threshold is 1 in 30. That means the agency has decided, through a formal process involving technical review boards and senior leadership, and ultimately the NASA administrator, that a mission whose estimated loss of crew probability is better than 1 in 30, meaning the crew is more than 30 times more likely to survive than not, meets the bar for proceeding with a crewed flight. 1 in 30 is not a comfortable number. Expressed as a percentage, it is a 3.3% chance of losing the crew. If you flew 30 Artemis missions with that exact risk profile, the statistical expectation is that one of them would end in crew loss. That is the threshold NASA considers acceptable for the most demanding human spaceflight program it has attempted since Apollo. The estimates for Artemis II did not settle neatly on one side of that threshold. The range that the agency's own analysis produced was 1 in 2 to 1 in 50. Read that again slowly. 1 in 2 to 1 in 50. The optimistic end of that range, 1 in 50, is a 2% chance of crew loss, well within the acceptable threshold. The pessimistic end, 1 in 2, is 50%, a coin flip. Expressed in the language of the formal risk framework, that pessimistic estimate is not close to the acceptable threshold. It is not in the same territory as the acceptable threshold. It is 15 times worse. The reason the range is so wide is itself revealing. It reflects genuine, deep uncertainty about how the modified re-entry profile will affect the heat shield's behaviour. The optimistic models, built on the revised understanding of the gas pressure mechanism and the arc jet testing under the direct re-entry profile, suggest the problem is solved and the risk is manageable. The pessimistic models, which give more weight to the fact that the system has already surprised its designers once in ways the original models did not predict, suggest that the uncertainty itself is the risk, that a system whose behaviour is not fully understood carries an irreducible probability of surprising you again. Both sets of models are built by serious, experienced engineers. Both are grounded in real data. Both represent honest attempts to quantify something that resists quantification. The gap between them is not a sign of incompetence. It is a sign of genuine scientific uncertainty about the behaviour of a complex material in a regime that has only been tested in flight once. Jared Isaacman reviewed all of it. The photographs of the Artemis I damage, the investigation findings, the revised models, the arc jet test results, the full probability range, and he made the call to proceed. His reasoning, articulated in the context of the broader program situation, rested on several pillars. The direct re-entry profile addressed the specific mechanism the investigation had identified. The ArcJet testing under the new profile showed acceptable results. The cabin integrity had held during Artemis I even with the unexpected material loss, demonstrating that the shield had more capacity than the models had suggested. And the alternative, a multi-year delay to redesign and requalify a new heat shield, carried its own risks to the program, to the workforce, to the international partnerships, and to the broader goal of returning humans to the moon before geopolitical and budgetary windows closed. These are not trivial considerations. They do not reduce the weight of the decision, but they are real, and they were part of the calculation that produced the answer: fly. What followed was not simply a decision to accept risk. It was a decision to manage it as aggressively as possible within the constraints of what was already built and what could be changed without rebuilding. The flight plan modification was the primary intervention, but it was accompanied by additional analysis, additional testing, and additional scrutiny of every aspect of the re-entry sequence that engineering could reach. NASA refurbished ArcJet facilities at Ames Research Center that had not been used for years, specifically to test avcoat samples under the modified direct re-entry heating profile. The tests were designed not just to confirm nominal performance, but to explore the edges, to find out how much material loss the underlying structure could absorb before cabin integrity was threatened, to understand the failure modes, to build the most complete possible picture of where the margins were and how thick they were. The results were used to update the models. The updated models were used to refine the risk estimates. The refined risk estimates were reviewed again by the technical leadership, and at every stage the answer remained the same. The mission could proceed. The risk was real, the uncertainty was real, but the engineering case for flying was stronger than the engineering case for standing down. There is something important to understand about what this decision was not. It was not a decision that the heat shield problem had been solved. The investigation findings were not reversed. Nobody claimed that the Artemis I damage was less serious than it appeared. The problem was understood, a specific mechanism was identified, a specific fix was implemented in the flight plan, and the available testing suggested the fix was effective. But the gap between what testing suggests and what flight confirms is exactly the gap that produced the Artemis I surprise in the first place. And that gap cannot be closed by more testing. It can only be closed by flying, which means that Artemis II is itself, among everything else it is, a test. A test of whether the modified re-entry profile solves the gas pressure problem that skip re-entry created. A test of whether the direct re-entry heating environment produces the controlled, predictable ablation that the revised models say it should. A test of whether 186 bonded avcoat blocks, under sustained single-pass heating with no interruption, behave the way they are now expected to behave. The difference between this test and Artemis I is that this one has people aboard. 4 specific people who reviewed the same data that Isaacman reviewed, who saw the same photographs, who sat through the same technical briefings and asked their own questions of the engineers who built the shield and analysed its damage, who understood the probability range and what each end of it meant in human terms, and who, having understood all of that, made their own decision. Independent of the program's decision, independent of the administrator's decision, driven by their own assessment of the engineering, their own understanding of the risk, and something harder to quantify than any probability estimate. The decision that 4 people make when they know the numbers and climb into the capsule anyway is not the same decision that an institution makes when it signs a flight rationale document. It is more personal than that, more specific. It lives in a different part of the human experience than engineering review boards and risk threshold frameworks. Understanding that decision requires understanding who these 4 people are, not what their resumes say, who they are in the way that matters when the capsule door closes and the rocket lights, and the only thing between you and the void is the engineering of other human beings and your own willingness to trust it. Because each of the 4 crew members of Artemis II brought something specific to that moment of decision. Something from their history, their training, their experience of physical risk in environments where the margin is thin and the consequences of being wrong are absolute. And what they brought tells you something true about the nature of courage that no probability estimate can fully capture. That is the next part of this story. Not the shield, not the flight plan, not the risk numbers. The people. The 4 human beings sitting inside a capsule the size of a large SUV, waiting for the signal to begin the most dangerous 10 minutes of a 10-day journey that no human being has attempted in more than half a century. There is a specific kind of person who chooses to do dangerous things professionally, not recklessly, not without understanding the risk, but deliberately with full knowledge of what the numbers say and what the consequences look like, choosing to operate in environments where the margin between survival and catastrophe is measured in small units of time and material and decision, where the engineering that keeps you alive was built by other human beings, tested as thoroughly as those human beings knew how to test it, and then handed to you with the honest acknowledgement that it has never been tested in exactly the conditions you're about to face. Military aviation produces this kind of person with some regularity, so does combat. So does the specific, grinding, a years-long process of astronaut selection and training that takes people who are already operating at the outer edge of human capability and pushes them further, past the point where confidence is comfortable, and into the territory where it has to be earned freshly every day. All 4 members of the Artemis II crew came from that world. And understanding who they are, specifically and individually, is not a biographical exercise. It is the only way to properly understand what it means that they looked at the risk data for this mission and got into the capsule. Reed Wiseman commands the mission. He's a United States Navy test pilot and a former astronaut who spent 167 days aboard the International Space Station during Expedition 41. But the detail that tells you the most about who Wiseman is does not come from his NASA biography. It comes from what carrier aviation actually demands of its pilots. Landing a fighter jet on an aircraft carrier at night is one of the most technically demanding tasks that human beings have designed for themselves. The deck is moving. It is pitching and rolling with the ocean beneath it. The landing area is roughly the size of a tennis court. The aircraft is approaching at over 250 kilometers per hour. The pilot has approximately 1 second from the moment the wheels touch down to determine whether the arresting wire has caught the hook, and if it has not, to go to full power and climb away for another attempt, in the dark, over open ocean, with no margin for hesitation. Wiseman did this hundreds of times. He did it at night, in bad weather, on seas that were not calm, in aircraft that were not forgiving. He knows, in the specific physical way that only direct experience produces, what it feels like to commit completely to a situation from which there is no retreat. To be past the point of decision, moving too fast to reconsider, with nothing left to do but execute the thing you trained for and trust that the engineering beneath you holds, that is re-entry. Different in its physics, similar in its essential demand. Full commitment, no abort, trust the machine. Victor Glover is the pilot of Artemis II. He is a Navy fighter pilot who flew combat missions before being selected as a NASA astronaut, and he spent approximately 6 months aboard the International Space Station as part of Crew 1 in 2020 and 2021, becoming the first black astronaut to serve on a long-duration mission aboard the station. His time in orbit was not a brief visit. It was an immersion in the sustained reality of living and working in an environment that will kill you without hesitation if the engineering around you fails in the wrong way. Long-duration spaceflight changes the relationship between a person and a risk, not by making risk feel smaller, but by making it feel more familiar, more present, more something that you live alongside rather than something you encounter occasionally. Glover spent months in an environment where the difference between the inside of the station and the vacuum of space was a few centimeters of aluminum and composite material. He understood, in a daily, physical way, that survival in space is always a function of engineering holding, of systems doing what they were designed to do, of trust, extended continuously, to the people who built the thing keeping you alive. He reviewed the heat shield data, he understood the risk range, and he made the same decision Wiseman made. Christina Koch is the mission specialist whose presence on Artemis II carries a specific historical weight. She will become the first woman to travel beyond low Earth orbit in the history of human spaceflight. That fact is worth sitting with. More than 60 years after the first humans left the planet, more than 50 years after the last humans went to the moon, this is the first time a woman has gone farther. Koch holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman in history. She spent 328 consecutive days aboard the International Space Station, returning to Earth in February 2020. 328 days, almost 11 months, living inside a vehicle in low Earth orbit, conducting science, performing spacewalks, managing the physical reality of what extended microgravity does to the human body, and doing all of it with the kind of sustained competence that makes 11 months in space look from the outside almost routine. It is not routine. It is never routine. It is a daily exercise in trusting engineering, following procedures, managing risk in an environment that offers no forgiveness. Koch knows this. She has lived it at a depth that few people on Earth have experienced, and she chose to go farther. Jeremy Hansen is the mission specialist from the Canadian Space Agency, and he carries a distinction that the other 3 crew members do not. When Artemis II launches, it will be his first spaceflight. He has trained for years. He is a former CF-18 Hornet fighter pilot with the Royal Canadian Air Force, experienced in high-performance aviation and the specific mental discipline that combat flying demands. But he has never been to space. This matters not because it makes him less prepared. His training is rigorous and his background is exceptional. It matters because it means that his decision to climb into this specific capsule, with this specific heat shield, with this specific risk profile, was made without the experiential reference point that his crewmates carry. He could not compare the risk data for Artemis II to his personal memory of what re-entry feels like. He had no memory of it. His decision was made on data alone, supported by the kind of professional assessment of risk that military aviation instills, but without the lived context that colours that assessment for the others. That may actually make his decision the most purely deliberate of the 4. He chose this, knowing what the numbers said, without the comfort of familiarity to soften the edges. All 4 of them went through the same process before the launch. They reviewed the Artemis I investigation findings in detail. They saw the photographs of the damaged heat shield, the irregular chunks of missing avcoat, the exposed layers that were never supposed to face re-entry temperatures directly. They sat with the engineers who had conducted the investigation and asked the questions that mattered to them personally. They examined the arc jet test data from Artemis. They studied the modified direct re-entry profile and understood what the trade-offs were. Higher peak heating, higher G-forces, a less flexible splashdown zone, no skip, and they understood the probability range, or the 1 in 50 to 1 in 2. They knew what those numbers meant. They were not shielded from the pessimistic end of the estimate. The culture of spaceflight, especially at the level these 4 people operate, does not protect its practitioners from uncomfortable data. It expects them to engage with it directly, honestly, and without flinching. They engaged with it. And then they made their decisions. Not a single one of them withdrew. Not one of them requested a delay to allow more testing or more analysis. Not one of them asked to be replaced by a backup crew member who'd reviewed the same data and reached a different conclusion. They all said yes, independently, personally, fully informed. There is something about that collective yes that resists simple characterization. It is not bravado. It is not indifference to the risk. It is not blind institutional loyalty. It is something more careful than any of those things. It is the considered judgment of 4 people who have spent their careers developing the specific capacity to assess danger accurately, to separate fear that is useful from fear that is not, and to act on their honest assessment rather than on either the comfortable story or the catastrophic one. What they assessed is that the engineering case for the modified direct re-entry profile is sound, that the arc jet testing is meaningful, that the mechanism identified in the Artemis I investigation is real, and that the fix implemented in the flight plan addresses it. That the probability range, even at its pessimistic end, reflects uncertainty more than it reflects a known flaw, and that the mission, with all of its risk, is worth flying. They got into the capsule, the hatch closed, and everything that the engineering team had built, tested, modified, analysed, and ultimately defended as sufficient was now in service of one purpose: bringing these 4 people home. There is a kind of waiting that is different from ordinary waiting. Not the waiting of someone who does not know what is coming. Not the restless, distracted waiting of a person checking a clock because time is moving slowly. But the focused, disciplined, professionally trained waiting of people who know exactly what is happening, exactly what the outcome will look like in either direction, and who have absolutely no ability to influence which of those directions the next few minutes will take. That is the waiting that happens in mission control in Houston during the 4 minutes of plasma blackout. And understanding what those 4 minutes mean to the people on the ground requires understanding first what the blackout actually is, how it works physically, and why 60 years of human spaceflight engineering have not been able to eliminate it. The plasma sheath that forms around a spacecraft during hypersonic re-entry is not simply hot air. It is a fundamentally different state of matter. When the air molecules in front of the descending capsule compress under the force of Mach 32 entry, they do not just heat up, they ionize. The electrons are stripped from their parent atoms by the energy of that compression, producing a gas of free electrons and positively charged ions that behaves in ways that ordinary air does not. One of those ways is electromagnetic. Free electrons interact with radio waves. They absorb them. They reflect them. They scatter them across multiple frequencies simultaneously in ways that are essentially impossible to compensate for with antenna design or signal power. The plasma sheath is not a wall that blocks radio signals the way a metal barrier does. It is an active electromagnetic environment that dismantles radio waves at the quantum level, converting their energy into heat and scattered radiation before they can carry information through. No radio frequency that human engineering currently uses for spacecraft communication can penetrate a plasma sheath of the density that forms around a capsule entering at lunar return velocity. Not the frequencies used for voice communication, not the frequencies used for telemetry data, not the frequencies used by GPS systems or radar tracking. All of them are absorbed or reflected before they can get through. The capsule becomes, for the duration of peak heating, electromagnetically isolated from the rest of the world. This is not a new problem. It has been part of human spaceflight since the very beginning. The Mercury astronauts experienced it in the early 1960s on their brief suborbital and orbital flights. The Gemini crews experienced it. Every Apollo mission experienced it, both during lunar orbit, when the capsule passed behind the moon and lost line-of-sight contact with Earth, and during re-entry, when the plasma blackout added a second period of enforced silence. But the Apollo re-entry blackout on a direct descent from the moon lasted roughly 3 minutes. 3 minutes of silence, followed by the return of the signal and the confirmation that the shield had held and the crew was alive. Artemis II, on its modified direct re-entry profile, is expected to experience a blackout of approximately 4 minutes during peak heating. 1 minute longer than Apollo. 1 additional minute of blank screens and counting seconds, and the specific, terrible discipline of trained professionals doing the only thing they can do, which is nothing. Rick Henling is the lead entry flight director for Artemis II. His job, for the vast majority of the mission, is active. He runs the team in Houston that monitors every system on the spacecraft in real time, interprets the data as it arrives, identifies anomalies, communicates with the crew, and makes the decisions that keep the mission on track. He is, in the language of his profession, in the loop, connected to the vehicle and the crew through the continuous flow of telemetry and voice that is the nervous system of a human spaceflight mission. During the 4 minutes of blackout, he is not in the loop. He is outside it, completely, not receiving data, not able to send commands, not able to speak to the crew or hear from them. Every screen in front of him that normally shows the living, breathing data of a spacecraft in flight will show nothing. He will sit at his console, his team will sit at their consoles, they will watch a clock, they will wait. This is not a failure of planning or a gap in the system design. It is an acknowledgement of physical reality. The plasma blackout cannot be engineered away with current technology. Proposals have been studied over the decades, including the injection of certain materials into the plasma sheath to reduce its electron density and the use of very high-frequency signals that might partially penetrate the sheath under specific conditions. None of these approaches has been developed into a reliable operational system for a vehicle entering at lunar return velocity. NASA has studied the possibility of using a relay satellite in a position where it might maintain partial contact with a re-entering capsule through the plasma. The geometry is difficult. The plasma sheath surrounds the capsule on all sides, not just the side facing Earth. There is no angle from which a relay satellite can reliably reach a vehicle wrapped in ionized gas moving at Mach 32, so the blackout stands. 4 minutes, accepted, trained for, but not eliminated. The weight of those 4 minutes is not abstract for the people who carry it. The history of spaceflight has given mission control 2 defining experiences of re-entry silence, and they sit at opposite ends of the emotional spectrum in a way that everyone in the building understands. In April 1970, the crew of Apollo 13 began re-entry after the most harrowing emergency in the history of human spaceflight. Their service module had been crippled by an oxygen tank explosion on the way to the moon. They had used the lunar module as a lifeboat for 4 days, navigating around the moon and back on limited power and resources. When they finally reached re-entry, nobody knew with certainty whether the explosion had damaged the heat shield on the command module. If it had, they would not survive. The expected blackout for Apollo 13 was 3 minutes. When the 3 minutes ended and the signal did not come back, the silence in mission control was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of people who had spent 4 days doing everything humanly possible to bring 3 men home, sitting with the possibility that it had not been enough. The blackout stretched to 4 minutes, then 5, then 6. Gene Kranz and his team sat at their consoles and watched the clock and said nothing. When Charlie Duke finally heard Jack Swiggert's voice cut through the static, the room broke, not gradually, immediately. The specific physical release of people who had been holding themselves together through professional discipline alone suddenly freed by the sound of a human voice from the other side of 4 minutes of silence that had felt, in its final seconds, like something else entirely. 33 years later, on February 1st, 2003, the crew of Space Shuttle Columbia began re-entry after a 16-day science mission. During launch, a piece of foam insulation from the external tank had broken free and struck the thermal protection tiles on the leading edge of the left wing. The damage had been identified in post-launch imagery review, but had been assessed through a process that subsequent investigation found deeply flawed as not a safety of flight concern. It was. During re-entry, superheated plasma entered the damaged area of the wing. The structural failure was rapid. Columbia broke apart over Texas and Louisiana at an altitude of approximately 63 kilometers, moving at roughly Mach 18. The crew of 7 had no warning. Mission Control did not know what had happened until the telemetry stream, which had been showing anomalous temperature readings in the left wing for several minutes, vanished completely and never came back. The silence after Columbia was a different kind of silence from the silence after Apollo 13. It was not a silence that ended with a voice breaking through static. It was a silence that simply continued, while teams in Houston worked through the data that was no longer arriving, and came to an understanding that took minutes to become words. Heat shield failure during re-entry is not a theoretical risk category in the engineering documents. It is a demonstrated cause of death. 7 people, 1 mission, 1 piece of foam, 1 area of damaged tiles, and a silence that did not end. Rick Henling knows this history. Every person in Mission Control on the day Artemis II re-enters knows this history. They have trained for the 4 minutes of blackout with the full awareness of what those historical silences represent. They know what it means when the signal comes back, and they know, in the specific private way that people who carry professional responsibility for human lives know things, what it means if it does not. The training for the blackout is real and extensive. Mission controllers run simulations of the full re-entry sequence, including the 4 minutes of silence, repeatedly during the months before the mission. They practice the discipline of doing nothing during the window, where nothing can be done. They practice the procedures that begin the moment the signal returns, the rapid assessment of incoming data, the confirmation of capsule integrity, the communication with the crew. But simulation is a controlled environment. Everyone in the room knows it is a simulation. The clock counting down in a simulation and the clock counting down during an actual re-entry of an actual spacecraft carrying 4 actual people are not the same clock, even if they read the same numbers. Everybody in that room knows that. And on the day it matters, when the screens go dark and the clock begins and the only thing left to do is wait, the 4 minutes will not feel like training. They will feel exactly like what they are. There is a sequence of events that begins at 122,000 meters above Earth's surface and ends in the Pacific Ocean. And it is the most precisely choreographed 10 minutes in the entire 10-day journey of Artemis II. Everything before it, the launch, the translunar injection burn, the long coast to the moon, the distant retrograde orbit, the days of science and observation, and the kind of quiet wonder that comes from watching the entire Earth fit inside a window, all of it is prologue. Necessary, complex, demanding prologue. But prologue nonetheless. The 10 minutes of re-entry are the mission. Not because everything else does not matter, but because everything else can be recovered from. A launch anomaly can sometimes be survived. An engine problem in transit can be worked around. A system's failure in lunar orbit has options attached to it, backup systems, contingency procedures, the possibility of a different path home. Re-entry has none of those options. It is the part of the mission where the laws of physics take over completely, where the engineering either holds or it does not, and where the crew and mission control and everyone watching from the ground have no choice but to accept whatever the atmosphere decides. Understanding that sequence step by step in the order it actually happens is understanding what 4 people will experience during the final descent of Artemis II. It begins with separation, approximately 10 days after launch. As Orion approaches Earth on its return trajectory, the guidance computer will execute a series of attitude adjustments that orient the vehicle for the events ahead. The European-built service module, which has been attached to the rear of the crew module for the entire mission, providing power through its solar arrays, propulsion through its main engine, water, oxygen, and the thermal management systems that have kept the crew alive in deep space, will separate. It is a clean break. Pyrotechnic bolts fire in sequence. The structural connections between the service module and the crew module sever, and 2 spacecraft become 1 spacecraft and 1 piece of debris. The service module, which has done everything asked of it across 10 days and more than 700,000 kilometers of travel, will fall into the upper atmosphere and burn up. Completely, intentionally. There is nothing recoverable about it, and nothing is meant to be recovered. It has served its purpose. What remains, falling alone toward Earth, is the crew module, a capsule roughly the diameter of a small living room and about as tall as a single-story ceiling. Inside it, 4 people in pressure suits, secured in their seats, watching the instruments that will tell them what the next 10 minutes look like as they unfold. The crew module will rotate. This is not a passive drift, but a commanded maneuver, executed by the guidance computer using the reaction control thrusters. There are small rocket engines positioned around the rim of the capsule that can push it in any direction needed to control its orientation. The heat shield must face the direction of travel. Everything depends on that geometry. If the shield is not correctly oriented when the atmosphere arrives, the heating will strike the wrong surfaces, and the surfaces that were not designed for it will not survive. The rotation completes. The heat shield faces forward into the direction of fall, and at 122,000 meters, Orion reaches entry interface. Entry interface is not a physical boundary. There is no line painted in the sky at 122,000 meters, no marker that the capsule crosses with a sound or a sensation, and it is defined altitude at which the atmosphere becomes dense enough to matter, dense enough to create measurable aerodynamic forces on the vehicle, dense enough to begin the process of deceleration that will, over the next 10 minutes, reduce Orion's velocity from 40,000 km per hour to approximately 27 km per hour at splashdown. That deceleration is not gentle. At peak loading, the crew will experience forces equivalent to roughly 6 times the normal pull of gravity. 6G. For reference, fighter pilots in high-performance maneuvers regularly experience similar forces for brief periods, which is part of why the backgrounds of the Artemis II crew are not coincidental. The human body can tolerate 6G for the duration of re-entry, but it is not comfortable and it is not trivial. The chest compresses, breathing requires deliberate effort, the visual field narrows at the edges, every kilogram of mass in the body feels like 6. Within 90 seconds of entry interface, the temperature on the face of the heat shield will cross 2000 degrees Celsius. The air in front of the capsule will have already begun to ionize. The glow will be visible through the windows, an orange and white light that the Apollo astronauts described as simultaneously beautiful and deeply alarming. The color of the atmosphere announcing that it is working on the vehicle. By the time the temperature reaches its peak, above 2760 degrees Celsius, the plasma sheath will be complete, fully formed. Surrounding the capsule on all sides, dense with free electrons, impenetrable to radio waves of any frequency that mission control uses to communicate. The screens in Houston will go dark. The clock will start. Inside the capsule, the crew will not experience the blackout as silence in the way that mission control does. They will hear the atmosphere, not as a sound that travels through the vacuum of space, because there is no vacuum anymore. There is dense, compressed, superheated air all around them, and it makes noise. A roaring, tearing, rushing sound that comes through the structure of the vehicle itself, conducted through the metal and composite and insulation as vibration that becomes audible. The Apollo astronauts reported it. It is not subtle. The windows will glow, the G-forces will mount, the sound will build. And for 4 minutes there will be no voice from Houston telling them that everything looks good, no telemetry confirmation that the heat shield is performing within parameters, no external reference of any kind to measure their situation against. There will be only the instruments inside the cabin, the readings that the capsule's own systems can produce from sensors mounted within the vehicle, and the physical sensations of deceleration and heat and noise that tell them the atmosphere is doing what the atmosphere does. The guidance computer will not be idle during this time. It will be continuously calculating the capsule's position and trajectory, comparing the actual deceleration to the predicted deceleration, and making small adjustments to the angle of attack using the reaction control thrusters. These adjustments keep the vehicle pointed correctly and trim the trajectory toward the planned splashdown zone. The computer does not need a radio link to Earth to do this. It carries its own reference systems, its own navigation data, its own computational capacity. It will manage the descent autonomously, as it was designed to do. The heat shield will be doing its work simultaneously. The avcoat blocks on the forward face of the capsule will be charring, under temperatures that exceed the melting point of titanium by more than 1,000 degrees. The char will form. The pyrolysis gases will vent through it. The outer layers will erode into the airstream, carrying absorbed thermal energy away from the structure. Layer by layer, the shield will retreat, and inside the cabin, the temperature will remain survivable because the engineering is holding, because the revised models are correct, because the fix worked. That is what NASA expects. That is what the ArcJet testing at Ames suggested. That is what the modified direct re-entry profile was designed to produce. Whether it is what actually happens will be known at a specific moment. The moment when the plasma thins, when the electron density in the sheath drops below the threshold at which it blocks radio waves. When the first fragment of signal, voice or data or a simple carrier frequency punches through the thinning plasma and reaches the antennas of the tracking stations or the relay satellites positioned to receive it. That moment will be immediately visible in Houston. Not gradually, immediately. 1 second the screens are dark and the next second data is arriving, the telemetry stream re-establishing itself, numbers populating the displays in front of the flight controllers, the voice loop opening up, the crew able to speak and be heard, assuming the shield held, assuming the direct re-entry profile performed as the model said it would, assuming that the avcoat blocks, under sustained single-pass heating with no interruption, behaved predictably enough that the material loss stayed within the margin that the underlying structure could absorb. If all of that is true, the signal comes back, and within seconds of its return, Rick Henling and his team will know it, not because anyone will announce it, because the data will announce it. A spacecraft whose heat shield has held produces a specific, recognizable pattern of returning telemetry. The systems are intact. The cabin pressure is nominal. The crew is responsive. The numbers make sense. After the signal returns, Orion will still be falling, fast but decelerating. At approximately 7,600 meters altitude, 2 drogue parachutes will deploy from the top of the capsule. They are not the main parachutes. They are smaller, designed to stabilize the capsule, to stop it from tumbling or spinning, and to slow it from roughly 480 kilometers per hour to a speed at which the main parachutes can safely open without tearing themselves apart. The drogues will hold for a measured interval. Then 3 pilot parachutes will fire, each one pulling out one of the 3 enormous main canopies that are packed into the top of the capsule. Each main parachute is approximately 35 meters in diameter when fully inflated. Together, the three of them will slow the descent rate from hundreds of kilometers per hour to approximately 27 kilometers per hour. A fast walking pace. Fast enough to feel at splashdown, but survivable. The Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego will be waiting. A United States Navy amphibious transport dock with recovery teams trained for exactly this moment will be positioned in the target zone. When the capsule hits the water, the impact will be cushioned by the final deceleration of the parachutes and the design of the capsule's lower structure, which is built to absorb the shock of a water landing at the expected descent rate. The hatch will open, the crew will be helped out, and the 10-day journey that began with the most powerful rocket NASA has ever launched will end with 4 people sitting on the deck of a Navy ship in the Pacific Ocean, breathing air that does not come from a tank, yet feeling the weight of their own bodies after days of weightlessness alive. That is the plan. Complete, sequential, precisely engineered from the first pyrotechnic bolt of service module separation to the last swing of the recovery swimmer's hand reaching through the open hatch. What the plan cannot guarantee is the thing that has always separated a flight plan from a flight. The atmosphere does not read the plan. The avcoat does not consult the models before deciding how to ablate. The plasma sheath does not check the schedule before forming around the capsule. The physics will do what the physics does, and in 4 minutes of silence the answer will arrive. There is a question underneath all of the engineering, beneath all of the risk numbers and the ArcJet tests and the modified flight profiles and the probability estimates. It is not a technical question. It has no answer in any database, or any simulation, or any document produced by the investigation teams that spent months examining the Artemis I heat shield damage. It is a question about why. Why? After 54 years of not going back, after more than half a century of sending humans only as far as low Earth orbit, after 2 generations grew up and grew old without a single person travelling beyond the thin shell of space that sits just above the atmosphere, why now? Why this? Why these 4 people in this capsule with this shield at this moment? The answer requires stepping back from the immediate engineering story far enough to see the shape of the larger one. In December 1972, Gene Cernan climbed the ladder of the Apollo 17 lunar module and became the last human being to stand on the surface of another world. He said something before he lifted off. He said that he believed humanity's departure from the moon was only temporary, that what had been started would be continued, that the footprints left in the lunar regolith would not be the last ones. He was wrong about the timeline, but he may not have been wrong about the direction. For 54 years, the reasons for not going back accumulated quietly. Budget pressures, shifting political priorities, the enormous cost of maintaining the Apollo infrastructure for missions that Congress was no longer willing to fund, the emergence of new priorities in human spaceflight, the space shuttle, the International Space Station, the development of a permanent human presence in low Earth orbit that seemed, for decades, like the natural next step rather than a detour. It was a detour, not a wrong turn, not a wasted half-century. The International Space Station has produced genuine scientific value and genuine advances in the understanding of how human bodies and human systems perform in long-duration spaceflight, but a detour nonetheless, in the sense that it represented a sustained pause in the outward movement that the Apollo program had begun. Artemis is the attempt to end that pause, not to recapture Apollo, which was a specific product of a specific geopolitical moment that no longer exists, but to build something more durable. A sustained human presence beyond low Earth orbit, beginning with the Moon, and oriented toward Mars as the long-term destination. A program designed not to plant flags and collect samples and return, but to establish the infrastructure, the knowledge, and the operational experience that could eventually support humans living and working in deep space routinely. That ambition requires a foundation, and the foundation requires proof. Proof that the vehicles work, proof that the life support systems work, proof that human bodies can tolerate the radiation environment beyond the Van Allen belts, the extended duration of deep space transit, the specific physiological demands of living in a spacecraft that is not protected by Earth's magnetic field. Proof that re-entry from deep space is survivable, repeatedly and reliably, not just once under ideal conditions. Artemis I provided partial proof. The vehicle flew, the systems worked, the re-entry happened. But the heat shield behaved in ways the models did not predict, and an unpiloted vehicle cannot provide the full picture of what a crewed mission demands. It cannot test the life support systems under actual use. It cannot assess how the radiation environment affects a living human body. It cannot demonstrate that the people who need to make decisions during emergencies can make them effectively from inside a capsule that is days away from Earth and cut off from immediate assistance. Artemis II provides all of those things, and it provides the one thing that Artemis I could not: a demonstration that the system can bring people home from deep space alive. If it works, the consequences extend far beyond this single mission. Artemis III, the mission that will actually land astronauts on the lunar surface for the first time since 1972, cannot fly until Artemis II has demonstrated that the ride home is survivable. The landing mission depends on the return vehicle. The return vehicle depends on the heat shield. The heat shield depends on 4 minutes of plasma blackout resolving in the right direction. The chain of dependency is that direct and that fragile. Beyond Artemis III, the implications extend further. The Gateway Lunar Space Station, currently in development with international partners including the European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, is designed to serve as a staging point for lunar surface operations and eventually for missions toward Mars. Its value depends entirely on the ability to transport people to it and from it safely. That transportation depends on Orion, which depends on the heat shield, every lunar landing that follows Artemis III, every long-duration stay on the surface. There's every piece of infrastructure built beyond low Earth orbit, every step toward Mars. All of it sits on a foundation whose cornerstone is a 5-meter ablative heat shield made of 186 bonded Avcoat blocks, currently attached to a crew module falling toward Earth at Mach 32, wrapped in plasma, out of radio contact with the ground. This is not an exaggeration of the stakes. It is the straightforward description of them. There is also a dimension to this mission that sits outside the engineering entirely, and that the probability estimates and the risk frameworks and the technical review boards cannot capture. It is the dimension of what this mission means to the 4 people inside the capsule, and what it means to the people watching from the ground, and what it means to the idea, which humans have carried for as long as they have looked up at the night sky, that this species is not permanently confined to one small world. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen are not symbols. They are specific people with specific skills and specific histories who made specific decisions. But they are also, unavoidably, something larger than themselves in this moment. Glover is the first black man to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Koch is the first woman. Hansen is the first Canadian. Wiseman is the commander of the first crewed deep space mission in more than half a century. These are not demographic footnotes. They are a statement about who the species is now, as opposed to who it was when 12 men, all American, all white, all military test pilots of a specific generation, walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. The crew of Artemis II is a different picture, not a perfect one. not the complete picture that a fully representative humanity would produce, but a different one and a truer one, and one that carries its own kind of meaning alongside all of the engineering. The radiation environment adds another layer to the risk picture that has not yet been fully examined. The crew of Artemis II launched during solar cycle 25, a period when the Sun is near its maximum activity. Beyond the Van Allen belts, the magnetic shielding that protects life on Earth's surface and in low Earth orbit does not exist. The crew will be exposed to galactic cosmic rays and to the variable flux of energetic particles from the Sun for the duration of their time in deep space. Orion has a dedicated radiation shelter, the most heavily shielded section of the crew module, where the 4 astronauts can gather if a solar particle event, a sudden burst of high-energy radiation from a solar flare or coronal mass ejection, is detected during the mission. The shelter provides meaningful protection for moderate events. Whether it is adequate for a worst-case solar particle event has never been tested with humans aboard a vehicle in deep space. It is another unknown in a mission that carries more unknowns than any American human spaceflight since the early Apollo program. The crew knows this. They reviewed the radiation risk data the same way they reviewed the heat shield data. They understood what the numbers said and what the gaps in the data meant, and they made the same decision about it that they made about everything else. They accepted it. Because the alternative was not going. And not going for these 4 people, after years of training and preparation and the specific patient commitment that the astronaut corps demands of its members, was not an answer that any of them was willing to give. There is something in that collective refusal to stand down that speaks to something older than the Artemis program, older than NASA, older than the specific geopolitical and technological context that produced the space age. It speaks to the thing that sent human beings across oceans before they knew what was on the other side. That drove exploration into mountain ranges and polar regions and ocean depths that offered no guarantee of return. That has always, in every era of human history, produced people who looked at a dangerous journey toward an unknown destination and said yes instead of no. The physics of re-entry does not care about that history. The plasma sheath forms regardless of the courage of the people inside the capsule. The heat shield ablates according to its material properties, not according to the intentions of the engineers who built it or the bravery of the crew it protects. But the history matters because it is the reason the capsule exists. It is the reason the engineers spent years building and testing and rebuilding and retesting. It is the reason 4 people with the skills and the backgrounds to choose safer careers chose this one instead. And it is the reason that the 4 minutes of silence when they arrive will not be endured by the people waiting on the ground as mere technical suspense. They will be endured as something much older and much heavier. The specific human experience of having sent someone you care about into danger, having done everything you could to prepare them and protect them, and now waiting in the silence that separates the sending from the knowing. The knowing will come. One way or the other, the signal will resolve itself. The plasma will thin. The answer will arrive in Houston in the form of data and voice, and the unmistakable pattern of a spacecraft whose systems are intact and whose crew is alive and speaking. Or it will not. And the silence will continue in a different way than it began. That resolution is close now. Closer than it has been at any point in this story. Because the final 10 minutes of Artemis II are not approaching. They are here. There is a moment coming that no one can stop, delay, or change. Not the engineers who spent years designing the heat shield. Not the flight directors who will sit at their consoles in Houston watching blank screens. Not the recovery teams positioned in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego, watching the sky for the first sign of parachutes. Not the 4 people inside the capsule, sealed into their pressure suits, secured in their seats, feeling the first whisper of atmospheric resistance begin to build around them like a hand slowly closing. The moment is coming because physics does not wait. Because a spacecraft moving at 40,000 kilometers per hour toward a planet does not pause for anyone to feel ready. Because the atmosphere, sea which has been waiting at 122,000 meters for the entirety of this 10-day journey, will do exactly what it always does when something arrives moving that fast. It will engage, and in that engagement, everything this story has been building toward will resolve itself. Not in a meeting room, not in a simulation, not in a document or a model or a risk estimate, in the real, physical, irreversible language of heat and pressure and time. The service module is already gone. The pyrotechnic bolts have fired. The European-built module that powered and propelled and sustained the crew for 10 days and more than 700,000 kilometers of travel has separated cleanly and begun its own final fall. Burning up in the upper atmosphere behind the crew module, consumed completely, or doing its last useful thing by getting out of the way. What remains is the capsule, alone. A vehicle roughly the size of a large SUV, carrying 4 people and everything that humanity has invested in this return to deep space, falling toward the blue-white curve of Earth, at a speed that makes the word falling feel inadequate. The heat shield rotates into position. The guidance computer confirms the angle of attack. The reaction control thrusters make their final small adjustments, trimming the trajectory with the precision of a system that has been calculating this moment for the entire descent. Everything that can be set is set. Everything that can be checked has been checked. The capsule is ready, in the specific sense that readiness means in this context. We're not safe, not guaranteed, but prepared, oriented, aimed correctly at the narrow corridor between too shallow and too steep, between skipping off into the void and burning too fast to survive. Entry interface arrives at 122,000 meters. The atmosphere becomes real. The first aerodynamic forces register on the vehicle's sensors. The deceleration begins, so gently at first that it is almost imperceptible, a faint pressure that will build over the next 90 seconds into something that presses the crew into their seats with 6 times the force of gravity. The temperature begins to climb, slowly, then not slowly. The air in front of the shield compresses under the force of arrival, and the compression converts kinetic energy into heat with a directness and efficiency that no industrial furnace can match. Within 90 seconds of entry interface, the temperature on the face of the heat shield crosses 2000 degrees Celsius. The glow begins. Orange at first, deepening toward white as the temperature climbs higher. The Avcoat blocks begin their work. The outermost layer chars. The pyrolysis begins. The gases form internally and move outward through the porous char toward the airstream. Layer by layer, the material sacrifices itself. The char erodes away in a continuous controlled process that carries absorbed thermal energy into the wake of the descending capsule and disperses it into the atmosphere behind. The temperature inside the cabin remains stable. The engineering is holding. But this is the moment that cannot be observed from the outside. This is the moment that the arc jet tests at Ames were designed to predict, and that the modified direct re-entry profile was designed to ensure. This is the moment when the difference between the skip re-entry that flew on Artemis I and the direct re-entry that Artemis II is flying becomes either the fix that solved the problem or the assumption that failed to capture something the atmosphere understood and the models did not. The char layer forms continuously under sustained heating. There is no pause. No moment where external heating drops and the char densifies, and the pyrolysis gases accumulate in pressurized pockets behind an increasingly impermeable barrier. The single-pass direct profile keeps the heat coming steadily, keeps the char layer permeable, keeps the gas venting pathway open. The mechanism that caused the chunky, irregular material loss on Artemis I, the internal pressure build-up during the skip phase, has no opportunity to establish itself. This is what the models say. This is what the testing at Ames suggested. This is what the engineers believe is happening on the face of that shield right now in the 4 minutes that Mission Control cannot see into. Within the capsule, the crew experiences the re-entry not as abstraction but as sensation. The G-forces press them deep into their seats. Breathing requires effort. The sound of the atmosphere comes through the structure of the vehicle, a deep, sustained roar that the Apollo astronauts described and that no ground simulation can fully reproduce, because it is not a recording or a vibration plate or a speaker. It is the actual sound of air compressed by a spacecraft moving at Mach 32, conducted through metal and composite and insulation and suit material into the body of a person sitting inside. The windows glow, the instruments show what they show, the capsule's own sensors report the cabin temperature, the structural loads, the deceleration profile, the altitude, the velocity. The crew can see that the descent is proceeding. They can see that the numbers are within expected ranges. They cannot see the heat shield directly. They cannot observe the ablation happening centimeters in front of them, on the other side of the pressure boundary. They can only read what the instruments tell them and trust the engineering that the instruments are measuring. 4 minutes, not a long time in most contexts, long enough to walk a few city blocks, long enough to listen to a short piece of music, long enough to read several pages of a book. In the context of a spacecraft descending through plasma at Mach 32, with 4 people aboard and every screen in Mission Control showing nothing, 4 minutes is a very specific kind of eternity. In Houston, Rick Henling sits at his console. His team sits at their consoles. The screens are dark. The voice loops are silent. The clock counts. There is nothing to interpret, nothing to respond to, nothing to communicate. There is only the discipline of waiting, which is itself a form of trust extended to the engineering in the absence of any ability to verify it in real time. This is the moment that the entire Artemis program has been approaching since Artemis I's heat shield came back damaged, and the investigation found the mechanism and the engineers modified the flight plan, and Isaac Mann made the call and 4 people climbed into the capsule. All of it, the years of design, the months of investigation, the arc jet tests, the revised models, the modified profile, the training, the decision, it all narrows to this: 4 minutes, 1 capsule, 1 shield, 4 people, and physics doing what physics does, completely indifferent to everything that human beings have invested in this moment. Then something changes in the plasma. The temperature at the shield face has passed its peak. The capsule has shed enough velocity that the compression heating begins to ease. The sheath of ionized gas surrounding the capsule starts to thin as the electron density drops. The barrier that has been blocking every radio frequency for 4 minutes becomes less absolute, then permeable, then suddenly, in the way that thresholds work, gone. The first fragment of signal reaches the tracking network. In Houston, a screen flickers. Data begins to arrive, not gradually but immediately. The telemetry stream re-establishing itself in a rush, numbers filling the displays in front of flight controllers who have been watching blank screens for 4 minutes and who now have more information than they can process in the first second of its arrival. But they do not need to process all of it in the first second. They need one thing: the pattern, the specific recognizable signature of a spacecraft whose systems are intact, whose cabin pressure is nominal, whose heat shield has performed within the margins that keep the structure behind it alive. And then a voice, not data. A voice. One of the 4 people inside the capsule, speaking on the voice loop that has been silent for 4 minutes, are saying something that might be a formal status report or might simply be words that come out of a person who has just come through something and needs to confirm to themselves as much as to anyone else that they are here, that they made it, that the shield held. The room breaks. Not in the way that rooms break in movies, with cheering and embracing and tears running freely down faces that have been composed for hours by professional discipline. In the specific, real way that people who have been holding themselves together through training and procedure and the conscious suppression of everything that is not useful suddenly do not need to hold on anymore. The release is different for every person in the room, but it is real and it is immediate. And it is the sound of 4 minutes of silence ending in the right way. The parachutes deploy in sequence, the drogues first, stabilizing the capsule, slowing it from its post-plasma velocity towards something that the main canopies can manage. Then the pilots, pulling the 3 enormous main parachutes out of their packs at the top of the capsule, the canopies filling with air 7,600 meters above the Pacific Ocean, each one 35 meters across, together slowing the descent to approximately 27 kilometers per hour, a survivable speed, the speed of return. The Pacific Ocean arrives. The impact is sharp and real and wet, and it does not matter. The recovery teams are already moving. The Navy ship is already turning toward the splashdown point. The swimmers are already in the water. The hatch will open. The crew will emerge one at a time into air that is warm and real and does not come from a tank. And when the last of the 4 is out, when all of them are on the deck of the recovery ship, breathing and alive and returned from the farthest point any human being has ever travelled, something will have changed. Not just for NASA, not just for the Artemis program, for the question that Gene Cernan left open when he climbed the ladder of the lunar module in December 1972 and became the last person to leave another world. The question of whether we were going back. The answer, in 4 minutes of silence and the signal that follows, will be yes. 54 years is a long time to wait for an answer to a question that simple. But the universe is not in a hurry. And neither, it turns out, are the 4 people who just proved that the question was still worth asking. Now, let the weight of that settle. Let the engineering and the risk and the silence and the signal all fall quiet inside you. Think about what it means that human beings can build something capable of returning from the moon, that they can face a material that damaged itself unpredictably and find a way through it without starting over. That 4 people can look at a probability range that includes a coin flip and choose to go anyway, not from recklessness, but from the considered, informed, the fully deliberate judgment that some destinations are worth the distance. You're lying in the dark in a warm room on a planet that is right now the only confirmed address of conscious life in the observable universe. The capsule has splashed down. The crew is safe. The shield held. And somewhere above you, past the atmosphere that tried to burn a spacecraft today and failed, the moon is right where it has always been. Closer now than it was this morning. Not because the distance changed. Because 4 people crossed it and came home. Close your eyes, the star's not going anywhere, and neither, it turns out, are we.